All right, today's topic, realism. Of course, here's a classic realist piece, The Fisherman's Wife. Very fun piece. What is it? Well, it's easy to say realism started as a European cultural movement that shifted the focus of art from the very extravagant and ornate to the more mundane and simplified as a more or less direct contrast to the previous styles of Romanticism and Neoclassicism. The shift would place focus on creating pieces, like I said, very plain and mundane, to try and capture a natural feel of people in their element and not the feeling of a staged event that would create a spectacle, if you would. As we have here, these are just people living their lives and nothing more to it. And the colors themselves, well, not just the colors, most elements to it try to distract from the idea of it being very grandeur-esque. Again, it's to capture the most realistic image possible. And it's also important to note that this art is very distinct in that, unlike its forebears, it didn't focus on things like the supernatural or an iconography of a religion to really portray it overall. It's just the most realistic view of people. It's also very distinct in that it's an active rejection of previous styles. This was largely unheard of for a lot of previous styles in that it was well known for actively antagonizing and rejecting mostly Romanticism at the time. When was it? While the element of realism itself has existed since the early classical era of ancient Greece, the realist movement, which is what this presentation is largely associated with, began in France in the 1850s, sometimes after the neoclassical and romantic periods. And of course, following the French Revolution of 1848, the movement became incredibly popular in the 19th century. The style's popularity would be contested multiple times throughout the 20th century with the continuous introduction of different styles. Despite this relatively simple concept in philosophy, realism really took off in Europe because of the low bar of entry it took to really understand what realism was all about. Yet it would taper off as well in some areas considering the high degree of skill necessary to create very realist pieces. Where was it? The realist artistic movement started in France but would spread to the rest of Europe and as far as Russia. It would also take off in many other countries, such as the US, and of course, due to the natural geographic inclination of something as simple in philosophy and practice as realism, it would take on many elements of the cultures it interacted with, such as Repin, one of the more famous realist painters, taking on a lot of Ukrainian elements in his realist styles. It's also important to note that, again, cultures do heavily influence these pieces themselves. So, regional differences would occur. And it's where these regional differences come in that we see a lot of more famous painters come in for realism towards the end of the realist movement, ironically enough. Trivia. All right. Realism as a movement, while it was pretty important itself, it was also incredibly influential to later movements. And it would spawn a number of pseudo-realist movements, if you would. One of these pseudo-realist movements had a kind of an odd name to it. Of course, this piece here is one of the pseudo-realist movements. So, what pseudo-realist movement led to the creation of this piece? No. Yes. No. He's right. Kitchen sink realism. To be entirely honest, I'm I looked into kitchen sink realism, and besides the fact that it largely based around a disgruntled society trying to fight the larger powers at hand by making an active rejection of some styles while also maintaining realism, I could not find an actual explanation to why it was called kitchen sink realism. I'm still on the fence about that one. Regardless. Now, if you've taken this class last semester, you should definitely know what this piece is. It's created by Andrew White. Of course, this is Christina's World, one of his most well-known pieces. Wythe was a very interesting person in that he was incredibly influenced by his father, N.C. Wythe, who was an illustrator, and the King Vidor movie, The Big Parade, which he has seen 180 times. I don't know how you could watch the same movie that many times, but I don't have the Presidential Medal of Freedom either, so. which Wyeth had earned. He's the first artist to actually be awarded such a distinguishing feature. Then we have Edward Hopper. This is a fairly iconic piece of his. Another well-known realist painter. He is well known for coming in the early 20th century and for his realist piece, Nighthawks. Of course, Hopper's early career was marked by a struggle to break into the industry, although later on through the Great Depression, his style itself would stand out, and he would eventually gain some pretty good success later. And then we go to Ilya Yefimovich Repin, the most, well, I wouldn't say the most, that's a hard term to give it. He is arguably the most famous and most influential figures in Russian realism and Russian painting altogether. He helped bring Russians into the mainstream of European art, considering prior to this, the Russian art didn't exactly stand out that much. Of course, his career began in the late 19th and early 20th century, and his most famous and controversial piece, which is simply titled Ivan the Terrible and His Son Ivan. Very intense piece, if you would. Of course, it's very controversial, considering at the time it was made, the Russian royal family was still active. Of course, it's also well known for having been vandalized twice and censored multiple times because of the graphic imagery. I guess this is also another case of when it had to be censored. Regardless, the piece was first vandalized, of course, by Russian nationalists, and it made curator Georgy Kruslov so distressed, he threw himself under a train. So, summary, the guy whose job it was to look over this thing was so distressed that it got attacked, if you would. It was slashed in multiple places. Threw himself under a train. Although luckily Repin was still alive when it was first vandalized, so he easily repaired it. Repin was also a large promoter of the Russian Revolution, although ironically because of his border closing between Finland and Russia later on, he was forced to stay in Kuokkala, Finland. Go figure. It would become the greatest influence and model for many Soviet painters later on, and whenever the Soviet Union annexed parts of Finland, they renamed the town of Kuokkala, where he lived, to Repino, in his honor, of course. Yes, this is what it looked like when it was first vandalized. Kind of a rough piece to put together. And then, of course, we have Adolf Friedrich Erdmann von Menzel, incredibly popular German realist artist, who was highly commended for his works, although he felt very isolated and distant because of his physical deformities of a large head and his height of 4'6". Go figure. But because of his fame and connections with the likes of Otto von Bismarck, he would be knighted and accepted as the first painter in the Order of the Black Eagle. I'd be remiss to not also mention that if you were to look into the works of Adolf Friedrich Erdmann von Menzel, you may see a weird intersection in history in that he is also well known for his artwork being used for the likes of later Nazi propaganda, considering its deep Germanic ties of German realism. Here we have our examples. Yeah. Wait. Yeah, all right, example. And resources. Any questions?
So what's the difference between this and dark romanticism?
So the darker of Romanticism itself, it focused, while not being largely realistic itself, because it focused more on emotions and darker colors and tones, realism itself focused on a more realistic approach to things. Romanticism itself would take a realistic approach for anatomy and character design and everything, but it focused on much darker, more heavier emotions and color use. Thank you.
So you would consider Edgar Allan Poe a dark romantic?
Well, in terms of literature, he would be a Gothic romantic artist. Although he was also, well, he was more of a writer than an actual artist. What? I am discussing realism. Will, you want to? Huh? Like the person or Edgar Allan Poe? All right, any other questions? All right.